Who would have thought that Stanley "Tookie" Williams, the ruthless Crips co-founder who once ruled Los Angeles with violence, would later spend his final years writing children's books and earning multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominations? But even that redemption couldn't erase his past crimes. In his final 24 hours, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger played a pivotal role, denying clemency and sealing Tookie's fate for good. The world watched as a man of terror and transformation faced his ultimate reckoning. The early years. Born on December 29, 1953, in Shreveport, Louisiana, Stanley "Tookie" Williams came into the world in a time and place where opportunities for young black Americans were scarce. His parents separated early in his life, and this change marked the beginning of a turbulent journey. In search of a better life, his mother packed up their belongings and moved them to South Central Los Angeles, a decision that would place Tookie at the heart of a community grappling with poverty, racial tension, and violence. As a young boy, Tookie was full of energy, often described as both mischievous and fiercely protective of those he cared about. His mother worked tirelessly to provide for him, but life in South Central LA wasn't easy. Their neighborhood was full of families struggling to make ends meet, surrounded by gang violence and systemic issues like redlining and limited access to quality education. The promise of a better life in California often felt like a distant dream. In school, Tookie struggled to find his footing. He was bright and capable, but often found himself distracted or disinterested in traditional classroom settings. His teachers noted his charisma and leadership potential, but these traits went unnoticed in an environment that lacked the resources to nurture them. Instead, Tookie gravitated toward the streets, where a different kind of education awaited. The 1960s were a time of great upheaval, and South Central LA was no exception. Stanley was a teenager by then, and the civil rights movement was in full swing. But the promise of equality hadn't reached Tookie's neighborhood. The Watts riots of 1965 had left a lasting scar on the city. Sparked by an incident of police brutality, the riots highlighted the deep racial tensions simmering beneath the surface. Instead, systemic racism and police brutality created a divide between the community and those meant to protect it. Despite the chaos around him, there were glimpses of a different path for Tookie. Friends and neighbors recall him as someone who could light up a room with his presence. He had a sharp wit and a natural ability to connect with people. In another life, these traits might have made him a successful businessman, a community leader, or even a politician, but in the world he knew, those same qualities made him a natural leader in the streets. Tookie's sense of loyalty was unmatched. He often defended younger kids in the neighborhood from bullies and wasn't afraid to stand up to authority figures when he felt something was unjust. This protective instinct would later become a double-edged sword, guiding both his early foray into gang life and his eventual transformation into an anti-gang activist. Stanley "Tookie" Williams was no ordinary teenager. Together with Raymond Washington, Tookie founded the Crips, one of the most notorious street gangs in Los Angeles, in 1971. What began as a group aimed at neighborhood protection soon spiraled into a cycle of violence, power struggles, and ruthless crime. The Crips quickly grew beyond their original purpose. Their reputation for ruthlessness made them a force to be reckoned with. Within a few years, the gang expanded across Los Angeles, gaining members and igniting violent turf wars with other gangs, most notably the Bloods. Tookie's leadership was instrumental in the Crips' rise. His imposing physical presence, charisma, and readiness to use violence earned him both fear and respect. By the mid-1970s, the Crips were no longer just a local gang. They had become a citywide phenomenon, deeply intertwined with the drug trade and criminal enterprises. Rival gangs responded in kind, leading to escalating violence. The once loosely organized fights between neighborhood groups turned into deadly battles. Guns replaced fists, and the body count began to rise. For Tookie, survival meant staying one step ahead, and he did so with a brutal efficiency that cemented his place as one of the most feared gang leaders in Los Angeles. By the late 1970s, the violence had reached a boiling point, and Tookie's name became synonymous with danger. In 1979, two separate crimes would forever alter the course of his life. The crimes. On the night of February 28, 1979, Albert Owens, a 26-year-old clerk at a 7-Eleven convenience store in Whittier, California, was nearing the end of a routine shift. He likely expected nothing more than a quiet evening of restocking shelves and ringing up customers. Instead, the night ended in a tragic act of violence that shocked the community. According to prosecutors, Stanley "Tookie" Williams, along with 3 accomplices, entered the store with the intent to rob it, complied fully with their demands. He handed over the money from the register and made no attempt to resist. Despite his cooperation, prosecutors alleged that Tookie decided to make an example of him. They claimed Tookie forced Owens to lie face down on the floor, taking a shotgun and firing a fatal shot into the back of his head. Witnesses later testified that Tookie mocked the sounds Owens made as he died, turning a cold-blooded murder into an act of cruelty. The motive for Owens' killing seemed bafflingly senseless. Some suggested it was to eliminate a witness, ensuring no one could identify them later. Others speculated that it was a calculated act of intimidation, designed to reinforce Tookie's reputation for ruthlessness. Whatever the reason, the murder left a young man dead, his family grieving, and a community reeling. Just 12 days later, on March 11, 1979, another crime shook Los Angeles to its core. This time, the victims were a family of 3 who ran a small, modest motel. Tsai Shai Yang, his wife Yen-Yi Yang, and their 43-year-old daughter Yi-Chen Lin were working late at their business when terror struck. Prosecutors alleged that Tookie, armed and accompanied by accomplices, targeted the motel for a robbery. The Yang family, much like Owens, complied with the intruders' demands, offering no resistance. Yet this act of obedience did not spare their lives. One by one, Tookie allegedly shot each family member at close range with a shotgun, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. The details of the murders were disturbing. The brutality went beyond the need to rob. It felt calculated, almost personal. Tsai Shai, Yen-Yi, and Yi-Chen were described as kind, hardworking immigrants pursuing the American dream. Their deaths devastated not only their family, but the wider immigrant community in Los Angeles. The paltry amount stolen was a mere $100, which only amplified the senselessness of the crime. Investigators and prosecutors speculated that the motive for the murders extended beyond financial gain. Some believed it was a statement of power, a way for Tookie to demonstrate his authority and instill fear, both in his rivals and within his own gang. This crime cemented the Crips' reputation as a violent, unstoppable force in Los Angeles. The back-to-back murders sent shockwaves through the city. Residents of Whittier and the surrounding areas were gripped by fear, feeling that even their quiet neighborhoods were no longer safe. The brutal nature of the killings, combined with the apparent randomness of the victims, left people questioning what kind of person could commit such atrocities. The media coverage only fueled the panic, with headlines branding Tookie and the Crips as symbols of unchecked violence. The Los Angeles Police Department had already been tracking Tookie for some time. However, it wasn't until the brutal murder in 1979 that the hunt for him became a top priority. Witness testimonies and forensic evidence tied these crimes to Tookie. Law enforcement saw his arrest as a significant blow to the Crips and a step toward addressing the escalating violence in Los Angeles. When officers finally moved in, it wasn't a quiet affair. Tookie, known for his physical strength and defiance, reportedly didn't make it easy for the Los Angeles Police Department. His arrest made the headlines that signaled the fall of a feared figure in gang circles. To the public, it felt like justice for the victims. To others, especially within his community, it raised questions about whether he was being targeted for his reputation rather than solid evidence. The trial. Tookie's trial was as much about him as it was about the larger issue of gang violence gripping Los Angeles. From the beginning, the prosecution painted him as the face of the problem, a ruthless gang leader who had taken multiple lives without remorse. They leaned heavily on witness testimonies, including those from former associates who claimed Tookie had confessed to the crimes. One key piece of evidence was a 12-gauge shotgun that prosecutors argued was linked to the murders. Ballistic tests and witness accounts placed it at the scene, further solidifying their case. The prosecution argued that Tookie had killed Albert Owens to eliminate a witness, despite the young man's compliance during the robbery. In the case of the Yang family, they emphasized the sheer brutality of the killings, suggesting they were motivated by more than just robbery. Tookie, however, maintained his innocence. He argued that the testimonies against him were coerced and that he was being framed because of his notorious status as a gang leader. His defense team struggled to counter the damning evidence and the prosecution's narrative. The media frenzy surrounding the trial didn't help, often portraying Tookie as the embodiment of gang violence. Public opinion was largely swayed against him, making a fair trial even more challenging. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of closure. For Tookie, it marked the beginning. Despite his cooperation, prosecutors alleged that Tookie decided to make an example of him. Tookie Williams was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. The courtroom was somber as the judge handed down the sentence, citing the gravity of Tookie's crimes and his role in perpetuating violence through the Crips. Tookie's reputation as a gang leader played a significant role in the decision. His perceived lack of remorse and the heinous nature of the murders left little room for leniency in the eyes of the court. San Quentin was a world apart from the streets Tookie once ruled. The notorious prison housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and life on death row was bleak. For Tookie, it was a time of reckoning, a place where he would confront his past and grapple with the reality of his situation. Stanley Tookie Williams' early years in prison were marked by defiance and anger. Convicted of heinous crimes, he refused to acknowledge guilt, viewing the system as inherently biased against him. But as time passed, the isolation of death row forced him to reflect. The man who once commanded fear on the streets began to look inward, sparking a remarkable transformation. While incarcerated, Tookie channeled his energy into writing, using his experiences to deter others from following his path. His children's books, such as Tookie Speaks Out Against Gang Violence, were straightforward and heartfelt, targeting at-risk youth. Through them, he shared the harsh realities of gang life, hoping to steer kids away from the choices that had led to his downfall. Among his most impactful works was his memoir, Blue Rage, Black Redemption. This deeply personal account chronicled his journey from a troubled childhood and rise as a gang leader to his eventual reckoning on death row. The book was raw and unflinching, offering readers a window into the mind of a man grappling with the damage he had caused. It became a beacon of hope for those seeking proof that change was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Tookie's transformation didn't stop with his writing. He became a vocal advocate for peace, working to broker truces between rival gangs. His unique credibility as a former gang leader gave his message a weight that few could replicate. Schools, community centers, and anti-gang programs across the globe used his writings to educate and inspire. The impact of his work garnered international recognition. Tookie was nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize and the Nobel Prize in Literature. These accolades brought attention to his efforts, sparking debates about redemption and justice. Supporters hailed him as living proof that even the most hardened individuals could change. To them, Tookie represented the possibility of a better future for at-risk youth. Despite his advocacy and the positive impact of his work, Tookie's legal team faced an uphill battle to overturn his conviction. They pointed to inconsistencies in the original trial, including alleged witness coercion and gaps in the evidence. Appeals were filed and reviewed, but each was denied, leaving his death sentence unchanged. Activists, religious leaders, and celebrities rallied to his cause, urging clemency as his execution date loomed. Figures like Jamie Foxx, Snoop Dogg, and Danny Glover argued that Tookie's transformation made him invaluable. They pointed out that his writings and outreach had saved countless lives, and his death would rob society of a powerful voice for change. However, his critics remained steadfast. Victims' rights advocates and law enforcement officials argued that Tookie's transformation didn't absolve him of the pain and loss he had caused. They also criticized his refusal to provide authorities with information about gang activities, claiming it undermined his claims of redemption. To them, his silence was proof that he hadn't fully renounced his past. The clemency debate culminated with California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. His decision to deny clemency highlighted the gravity of Tookie's crimes and the lingering questions about his role in them. Schwarzenegger acknowledged Tookie's advocacy, but argued it couldn't erase the harm he had inflicted. The decision polarized public opinion, drawing both outrage and relief. For some, the denial of clemency was justice served, a necessary conclusion to a life marred by violence. For others, it was a missed opportunity to recognize the power of redemption and the potential for rehabilitation, even for those who had committed grievous acts. The last 24 hours. The journey of Stanley Tookie Williams from co-founder of the Crips to a Nobel Peace Prize nominee culminated in his final hours at San Quentin State Prison. On December 13, 2005, the world watched as the clock ticked toward midnight, marking the end of a life that had been a mix of violence, redemption, and controversy. By 6 p.m., the prison's routine gave way to somber final preparations. Williams was strip-searched, provided with a fresh set of clothes, and escorted to a designated death cell. This 45-square-foot room, just steps away from the execution chamber, became his final holding place under the constant surveillance of a sergeant and 2 officers. Inside the cell, Williams occupied himself by reading letters from supporters worldwide. Over 50 arrived that day alone, sent from places as distant as Italy and Israel. Many were from children expressing prayers and admiration for his advocacy against gang violence. A prison chaplain stood nearby, offering counsel, but Williams chose not to reach out. Despite being offered a sedative to ease his nerves, he declined, maintaining composure in the face of what lay ahead. Outside the prison, the atmosphere was anything but calm. A crowd of about 2,000 protesters gathered, carrying signs, chanting, and pleading for a last-minute reprieve. Among them were celebrities, activists, and anti-death penalty advocates, all united in their belief that Tookie's life should be spared. "Tookie must live, and Tookie doesn't deserve to die," echoed through the night. Civil rights leader Jesse Jackson, a vocal supporter, criticized California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's decision to allow the execution to proceed, calling it revenge over redemption. Jackson argued that taking Williams' life did nothing to ensure public safety, instead framing it as a political move to Project Toughness. Despite the storm outside the gates, Williams remained composed. He declined a formal last meal, requesting only small cartons of milk instead. Even in these final moments, his stoicism carried him forward, refusing to let the state's preparations rob him of his dignity. At 9:30 p.m., Williams' legal team filed an emergency petition in a last-ditch effort to save him. They presented statements from a 4th witness who claimed that other inmates had attempted to frame Williams for the murders. Yet this appeal, like the others before it, was swiftly denied. Governor Schwarzenegger once again stood firm, declaring that Williams' transformation and advocacy were insufficient to outweigh the severity of his crimes. With that decision, any remaining hope was extinguished. As midnight approached, the time came for Williams to face his fate. He was escorted into the execution chamber, a cold, semi-octagonal room bathed in sterile light. At its center was a padded gurney where his life would end. Despite the gravity of the moment, Williams walked in with an air of quiet strength, his head held high. He calmly laid down on the gurney, where guards began the process of securing him with thick straps. A nurse stepped forward to insert the IV lines necessary for the lethal injection, but complications arose. Finding a vein in his left arm proved difficult, causing the process to take nearly 20 minutes. At one point, Williams, visibly restless, asked the staff, "You doing that right?" His words were a mix of concern and quiet frustration as the preparation continued. As the nurse struggled, Williams turned his gaze toward his loved ones seated among the witnesses. Though his words were inaudible, he mouthed something to them, a silent farewell that carried the weight of the moment. At 12:21 a.m., the execution began. The first drug administered was 5 grams of sodium pentothal, a powerful sedative designed to render him unconscious. Within moments, Williams' body relaxed, his breathing slowing as the drug took effect. This was followed by pancuronium bromide, which paralyzed his muscles and halted his ability to breathe. Finally, potassium chloride was injected to stop his heart. Witnesses in the room watched in silence as Williams' body lay still. Among them were journalists, state officials, and 5 personal witnesses Williams had selected. The somber atmosphere was punctuated by sobs from his supporters. Barbara Bicknell, a close ally and advocate, cried out, declaring, "The state of California just killed an innocent man." Her anguish reflected the deep divisions surrounding Williams' case. At 12:35 a.m., the warden officially pronounced Stanley Tookie Williams dead. The room remained silent as the announcement echoed, marking the end of a life that had sparked both fear and hope. At 78 years old, Carl Wayne Bunchen became the oldest inmate ever executed in Texas, a depressing milestone that highlighted the gravity of his crimes. His execution on April 21, 2022, marked the state's first in over 20 years, a decision that reignited debates about justice, accountability, and the death penalty. But what makes this case particularly haunting is the cold-blooded act that put him on death row, a crime that shattered a community and the victims' families. Early life. Carl Wayne's story began in an environment that shaped the choices he would make later in life, for better or worse. Born on March 30, 1944, alongside his twin brother, Kenneth Bunchen, Carl grew up in modest circumstances in Harris County, Texas, a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. His family, while hard-working, struggled to make ends meet. Carl's father, James Durward Bunchen, held a series of low-paying, physically demanding jobs, often leaving him exhausted and emotionally distant. Meanwhile, his mother, tasked with maintaining the household, was stretched thin between caring for Carl and his younger siblings. Despite these challenges, Carl showed early promise in school. Teachers noted his quick wit and sharp mind, qualities that could have set him on a legit path toward success. However, these strengths were overshadowed by behavioral issues. Carl had a defiant streak, often clashing with authority figures. While some saw this as youthful rebellion, others recognized it as a sign of deeper issues brewing beneath the surface. As Carl entered adolescence, the cracks in his life began to widen. His parents' strained relationship eventually led to a bitter separation, leaving Carl, his twin brother Kenneth, and their younger brother Bobby to navigate the fallout. The absence of his father was particularly impactful. With no stable male role model, Carl sought guidance elsewhere, often in the wrong places. He gravitated toward older boys in the neighborhood who seemed confident and self-assured, but were, in reality, involved in petty crimes and delinquent activities. These early associations introduced Carl to a lifestyle that prioritized quick and short-term rewards over long-term goals. What began as minor infractions, skipping school, shoplifting, or sneaking out at night, escalated over time. By his late teens, Carl had dropped out of school entirely. Without an education or stable employment prospects, he found himself relying on the very behaviors that had initially seemed thrilling and rebellious. Carl's criminal activities during this time were random and relatively low level, but they were a clear indicator of his trajectory. He started with minor thefts, targeting convenience stores and local businesses. These acts, while not violent, demonstrated a growing disregard for the rules of society. He quickly developed a reputation in his community as someone to avoid, a young man with a dangerous edge and little concern for consequences. In his early 20s, Carl's life took a darker turn. By this point, he had been in and out of juvenile detention centers and had a criminal record that included theft, vandalism, and public disturbances. These run-ins with the law only deepened his cynicism, reinforcing a belief that the system was rigged against him. He stopped looking for legitimate work and instead focused entirely on illicit activities, often working with gangs to plan and execute petty crimes. According to sources, one pivotal moment came when Carl was introduced to a more seasoned gang leader during a stint in jail. This individual was also serving time in jail and had a history of violent offenses, took Carl under his wing, mentoring him in more serious forms of crime. Carl's transition from petty theft to more organized and calculated criminal behavior was swift. He began participating in burglaries, learning how to break into homes and businesses without leaving a trace. These crimes, while more lucrative, also carried greater risks. Carl's personal relationships suffered during this period. Friends and family members who had once tried to steer him toward a better path began to distance themselves, either out of fear or frustration. Even those who cared deeply for him found it difficult to reconcile the person they once knew with the increasingly hardened individual he had become. Despite his growing notoriety, Carl showed little remorse for his actions. When confronted, he often dismissed his behavior, claiming that he was simply doing what he needed to survive. However, those close to him suspected that his actions were driven less by necessity and more by a deep-seated anger and need for control. His descent into a life of crime was complete. He had become adept at navigating the criminal underworld, building a network of contacts who could supply him with tools, information, or alibis as needed. His crimes grew bolder and more dangerous, pushing the boundaries of what he had previously been willing to risk. The crimes. By the time Carl reached his late 20s, his criminal activities took a sharp and dangerous turn as he transitioned from petty offenses to more serious and organized crimes. His actions, once random and low stakes, became methodical and increasingly severe. It was around this time where Carl had established himself as a calculated individual, willing to push legal and moral boundaries for personal gain. One of Carl's first known major crimes occurred when he orchestrated a burglary at a local jewelry store. This was no impulsive act, it was carefully planned. Carl scouted the location for weeks, studying the store's security measures and identifying weak points. On the night of the break-in, he used tools provided by a contact he met during a prior stint in jail. The robbery was swift and clean, leaving law enforcement initially puzzled about how he had bypassed the alarm system. Although Carl avoided immediate detection, this crime put him on law enforcement's radar. Investigators discovered a pattern when similar robberies occurred in nearby towns, all marked by a lack of physical evidence and the same targeted approach. Emboldened by his initial success, Carl began targeting high-end homes and businesses. These crimes demonstrated his ability to adapt and refine his methods. For residential break-ins, Carl would often strike during the early evening when families were out for dinner or attending events. In some cases, he used insider information obtained through casual acquaintances, learning about security systems and household schedules. What set Carl apart was his meticulous planning. He would use disguises to blend into neighborhoods and avoid suspicion, ensuring no detail was overlooked. While these crimes rarely involved violence, they created a sense of unease in the communities he targeted. Homeowners expressed fear and frustration, leading to heightened security measures and local law enforcement increasing their patrols. Carl's shift from calculated burglaries to more reckless actions occurred during one of his break-ins. In what was supposed to be a routine burglary, he unexpectedly encountered a homeowner who had returned earlier than anticipated. Startled, Carl panicked and used force to subdue the individual. Although the homeowner survived the encounter, the event marked a turning point in Carl's criminal trajectory. It was no longer just about theft. Violence had entered the equation. This incident attracted significant media attention, with headlines describing the intruder as a dangerous and unpredictable threat. Community members began rallying for more robust police efforts, and law enforcement ramped up their investigation, determined to connect the dots between the growing list of crimes. Following the botched burglary, Carl's crimes grew more audacious. He shifted his focus to armed robberies, targeting convenience stores and small businesses that lacked substantial security measures. Armed with a weapon, Carl often threatened employees to ensure compliance, but he rarely inflicted physical harm. One notable robbery occurred at a gas station in Harris County late at night. Carl entered wearing a ski mask and brandished a firearm, demanding cash from the clerk. While no one was injured, the robbery left the employees traumatized and the community outraged. Surveillance footage from the store provided investigators with a blurry but usable image of the suspect, further tightening the noose around Carl's activities. By this point, law enforcement began piecing together a profile of Carl Wayne. Investigators noted similarities across the crimes, including his careful planning, use of minimal physical evidence, and preference for striking vulnerable locations. They also observed that Carl rarely operated with accomplices, making it challenging to track him through associates. The turning point in the investigation came when forensic evidence from one of Carl's earlier crimes linked him to a vehicle he had borrowed during a robbery. The connection, though weak, gave investigators a lead that they pursued relentlessly. Carl's criminal spree reached its apex on June 27, 1990, with a bold and tragic act that not only sealed his fate, but left a deep scar on Houston, Texas. During a routine traffic stop, Carl Wayne Bunchen fatally shot Houston police officer James Irby, a crime that became the defining moment of Carl's life and the ultimate breaking point in his years of escalating criminal behavior. Officer James Irby, a 37-year-old veteran of the force and father of two, had been conducting a traffic stop for a minor violation. The driver, an acquaintance of Carl's with a history of petty offenses, had no idea the encounter would end in bloodshed. Carl was a passenger in the vehicle, a fact that would alter the course of events. As Officer Irby approached the vehicle, Carl's mindset was clear. He was armed, desperate, and unwilling to face another stint behind bars. The moment the officer neared the driver's side, Carl exited the car abruptly. Witnesses later recounted that Carl appeared calm but calculating, as though he had already decided his course of action. Without warning, Carl raised his .357 Magnum revolver and fired directly at Officer Irby, hitting him in the head. As the officer fell to the ground, Carl fired additional shots into his back to ensure the kill before fleeing on foot. The scene that followed was one of chaos and horror. Witnesses, including nearby pedestrians and other drivers, reported hearing the gunshots and seeing Carl flee. One witness described the sheer terror of the moment, saying that the sound of gunfire was followed by the sight of Officer Irby collapsing to the ground. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but it was too late. Officer Irby was pronounced dead at the scene. The murder was not just an attack on an individual. It was seen as an assault on the entire community. Officer Irby had served on the Houston police force for over a decade, earning a reputation as a dedicated and compassionate public servant. The loss of a father, husband, and law enforcement officer sent shockwaves through the city, leaving both the police department and the public reeling. After Officer Irby's unfortunate murder, the Houston Police Department launched an all-out effort to locate and apprehend Carl, while the community mourned the loss of one of its own. Public outcry grew rapidly, with many demanding swift action and harsh punishment for Carl's actions. Memorials for Officer Irby were held across the city, with hundreds of residents and law enforcement officers attending to pay their respects. The case also gained significant media attention, both locally and nationally. News outlets covered the story extensively, portraying Carl as a dangerous and remorseless criminal. The pressure on law enforcement to capture Carl intensified with each passing day, as the city of Houston demanded answers. With his name and face plastered across newspapers and television screens, Carl's days on the run were numbered. The murder galvanized detectives and the broader police force, who were now determined not just to bring Carl to justice, but to ensure that such a crime would never happen again. Carl's arrest came shortly after the fatal shooting. Acting on tips from witnesses, law enforcement tracked him to a motel where he was staying under a false name. A tactical team surrounded the building, cutting off all potential escape routes. Realizing he was cornered, Carl attempted to flee through a back exit, but was quickly apprehended. The arrest marked the end of Carl's years-long criminal activities and brought a sense of relief to a community reeling from the loss of Officer Irby. Authorities recovered key evidence from Carl's motel room, including burglary tools, stolen property, and a .3 M57 Magnum revolver, the weapon used in the murder. These items not only tied him to the crime, but also bolstered the case prosecutors would build against him. The trial. After Carl Wayne Bunchan's arrest, the legal system quickly moved to bring him to trial, with the case gaining significant media attention. The brutal murder of Officer James Irby, a beloved Houston police officer, had shaken the community to its core. Residents eagerly followed every development, with the courtroom packed during each session as prosecutors meticulously laid out their case. The prosecution built its argument around Carl's long history of criminal behavior, culminating in the fatal shooting of Officer Irby. Items recovered from Carl's motel room, including burglary tools, a firearm, and stolen property, bolstered their case. However, the centerpiece of their argument was the evidence directly linking Carl to the killing of Officer Irby. This was no ordinary trial. It was seen as a fight for justice for the family of a father, husband, and public servant who had been gunned down in cold blood. The prosecution's case hinged on several critical pieces of evidence. Ballistics tests conclusively matched the firearm recovered at Carl's arrest to the bullets that killed Officer Irby. Eyewitnesses from the scene described seeing Carl fire the fatal shots and fleeing on foot. Additionally, surveillance footage from nearby businesses placed Carl at the scene of the crime just moments before the shooting. Perhaps the most powerful moments of the trial came during the emotional testimonies from Officer Irby's family. His wife, Maura Irby, described the devastating impact of losing her husband. She recounted how their children, aged 7 and 3 at the time, struggled to understand why their father wasn't coming home. Her testimony painted a heartbreaking picture of the personal cost of Carl's actions, leaving the jury visibly moved. The defense attempted to mitigate the charges by emphasizing Carl's troubled upbringing and mental state. They argued that his life of crime was a product of systemic failures and abusive experiences, urging the jury to consider life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. However, this argument struggled to gain traction against the overwhelming evidence and the emotional weight of the Irby family's loss. A turning point in the trial came when law enforcement officers detailed the calculated nature of Carl's actions during the shooting. Prosecutors highlighted how Carl shot Officer Irby multiple times, including in the back, to ensure he wouldn't survive. This deliberate act left no room for doubt about Carl's intent, further solidifying the case against him. Throughout the trial, Carl's demeanor remained detached. He showed little emotion, even during the most damning testimonies or when the Irby family spoke of their grief. Observers noted his lack of visible remorse, interpreting it as either indifference or a refusal to confront the gravity of his actions. When given the opportunity to address the court, Carl's statement was brief and deflected responsibility. He acknowledged his role in Officer Irby's death but attributed his behavior to his troubled past and lack of opportunities. These words, lacking genuine contrition, failed to sway the jury, who had already been presented with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts, including capital murder for the killing of Officer Irby. The decision was unanimous, reflecting the strength of the evidence and the gravity of Carl's actions. Following his conviction, Carl was transferred to Polunsky Unit, a maximum security prison located in Livingston, Texas, to await execution. Life on death row was a stark contrast to the freedom he had once taken for granted. Confined to a small cell for most of the day, Carl had limited interaction with others, save for occasional visits from legal representatives or prison staff. During his time on death row, Carl's legal team filed multiple appeals in an attempt to overturn his sentence. They argued that his upbringing and mental state should have been given more weight during the trial. However, these appeals were largely unsuccessful, with higher courts upholding the original verdict and sentence. Carl's time in prison was marked by isolation and introspection. Accounts from prison staff suggest that he spent much of his time reading and writing, though the content of his writings remains largely unknown. Some speculate that he may have been reflecting on his life and the choices that had led him to this point, while others believe he was simply trying to pass the time. As Carl's execution date drew closer, the mood on death row shifted. Prison staff noted a change in his demeanor, describing him as quieter and more withdrawn. It was clear that the reality of his situation had begun to set in. Legal avenues for appeal were nearly exhausted, and the finality of his sentence was very close. The final 24 hours. The final chapter of Carl Wayne Bunch's life began on the evening of April 20th, 2022. At approximately 7 p.m., prison staff formally informed Carl of the schedule for his execution the following day. Although he had known the date for weeks, this notification brought the inevitability of his fate into clear focus. Reports indicate that Carl spent the evening in his cell, appearing calm yet introspective. Guards observed him quietly reading a Bible for much of the night. Whether this was an act of faith or simply a means to pass the time remains unclear, but it set a somber tone for the hours ahead. By 10 p.m., the prison adhered to its standard routine of lights out. Carl lay on his cot, though it is uncertain whether he managed to sleep. Prison staff later noted that it is common for inmates facing execution to find rest elusive, burdened by the weight of their impending fate. At 6 a.m. on April 21, 2022, Carl was awakened by prison staff to begin his final day. He was offered breakfast consisting of standard prison fare, though he barely touched it. This lack of appetite reflected the gravity of his situation and a subdued state of mind. Elsewhere in the facility, preparations for the execution were underway. Guards maintained a strict schedule to ensure all protocols were followed, while Carl remained compliant. Around 9 a.m., Carl met briefly with his attorney, David Dow. This meeting, largely procedural, provided an opportunity to address any lingering legal matters or personal reflections. By this point, all appeals had been exhausted, and there was little left to discuss. Accounts suggest that Carl appeared resigned, expressing a mixture of regret and acceptance. David Dow later described the interaction as somber but professional. noting that Carl displayed little emotion during the exchange. At approximately 11 a.m., Carl was granted a final visit from family members. While estranged from much of his family for years, they came to say their goodbyes in a meeting described as tense but meaningful. The visit, lasting less than an hour, offered a brief moment of human connection before the inevitable. Family members refrained from discussing the details of his crimes, instead focusing on offering solace during his final hours. Due to Texas policy, Carl was not offered a special last meal of his choosing. Instead, he was served the same standard meal provided to all inmates that day. Reports indicate that Carl ate very little, reflecting a subdued and introspective demeanor. Witnesses also observed Carl sitting in his cell, often staring at the walls in silence. His lack of appetite highlighted the weight of his situation, though he outwardly remained calm. By 3 p.m., Carl was moved to a holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. This marked the transition from the routine of death row to the final hours before his execution. Guards conducted routine checks, ensuring compliance with strict protocol. During this period, Carl reportedly spent time in quiet prayer. Whether this reflected genuine faith or an effort to find solace is unclear. Witnesses described him as calm and resigned, showing no visible signs of panic or defiance. At 6:00 p.m., Carl was escorted into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. Among those present were members of Officer James Irby's family, legal representatives, and media personnel. Each carried their own emotions into the room, ranging from quiet anticipation to somber reflection. Carl was secured to the gurney as the execution team prepared to administer the lethal injection. When asked if he had any final words, Carl addressed those present in a calm voice. He acknowledged his crimes and expressed regret, stating his hope that his death might bring peace to those he had harmed. The lethal injection process began at 6:15 p.m. Medical professionals administered the drugs in a precise sequence, designed to ensure a swift and painless death. After about 24 minutes, Carl Wayne Bunchen was pronounced dead at 6:39 p.m. on April 21, 2022, at the age of 78. He became the oldest inmate ever executed in Texas and the state's first execution of 20. On death row, every minute counts, and for Marlon Joseph, his final 24 hours were a haunting countdown to justice. Convicted of the cold-blooded murders of a mother and her 11-year-old daughter, Marlon's story is full of violence, manipulation, and the devastating ripple effects of his actions. As the clock ticked closer to his execution, what did his final moments reveal about the man behind the crime? Early life. Marlon Joseph was born into a working-class family in a small Florida community, a setting that was as much a challenge as it was a defining factor in his life. Growing up, Marlon rarely experienced the kind of stability that many children take for granted. His mother, Robin Denson, worked long hours to provide for him and his 3 siblings, but the absence of a strong paternal figure created a noticeable gap in his upbringing. From a young age, Marlon seemed to be caught in the crosshairs of circumstance. His academic life reflected his home environment and inconsistent. Teachers frequently noted his inability to focus and his disruptive behavior in class. While these tendencies were often dismissed as typical childhood mischief, they gradually escalated. By the time Marlon reached middle school, his defiance toward authority figures and peers had earned him a reputation as a troubled kid. These behaviors, though concerning, went largely unaddressed, leaving him without the guidance he desperately needed. Marlon's teenage years marked a turning point in his life. Marlon began spending more time on the street than home, often with peers who shared his feelings of alienation. Unfortunately, these relationships did more harm than good. Many of his friends were involved in petty crimes, shoplifting, vandalism, and occasionally drug use, and Marlon quickly found himself following suit. What began as a way to fit in with his social circle soon became a coping mechanism for his internal struggles. At school, Marlon's behavior continued to deteriorate. According to some of his teachers, he frequently skipped classes and, when present, disrupted lessons with outbursts or pranks that earned him repeated suspensions. By the time he reached high school, he had gained a reputation as someone teachers viewed as a lost cause. This lack of support only deepened his feelings of isolation, and by age 16, he had dropped out of school entirely. Marlon's relationship with his mother, who had always been a stabilizing force in his life, took a significant hit during his teenage years. The two often clashed over his behavior, and their arguments frequently escalated into shouting matches. While Marlon's mother tried to steer him back on track, her efforts were largely unsuccessful. The absence of a consistent paternal figure in Marlon's life likely compounded the issue, leaving him without a male role model to guide him through these turbulent years. Adding to the family's challenges were Marlon's 3 younger siblings, who often had to deal with the household tension. Marlon, feeling cornered by his mother's attempts to discipline him, would lash out at his siblings, further straining familial bonds. His mother, overwhelmed by the demands of raising multiple children on a limited income, struggled to address these issues effectively. This toxic cycle of conflict and resentment became a defining feature of Marlon's home life. Despite his challenges, Marlon occasionally displayed glimpses of the person he could have been under different circumstances. He found random employment in low-paying jobs, such as landscaping and fast food, and for brief periods, he seemed determined to improve his situation. Friends recalled moments when Marlon expressed a genuine desire to turn his life around, often speaking about wanting to prove everyone wrong. However, these efforts were short-lived. The crimes. By his early 20s, Marlon's life had become a series of poor decisions and missed opportunities. His criminal record, which began with minor infractions like shoplifting and trespassing, quickly escalated. The day Marlon Joseph committed the crimes that would shock his community began like any other, but it would end in unimaginable tragedy. On December 28, 2017, in West Palm Beach, Florida, Marlon's actions escalated into horrifying violence that left 2 innocent lives lost. The victims were Caladea Kroll, a 36-year-old woman known for her compassionate and loving nature, and her 11-year-old daughter, Kira Inglet, a bright and cheerful child with a promising future. The events unfolded in the home the 3 shared, a modest residence that Marlon also lived in with his mother, Robin Denson, and other family members. The household was far from peaceful. Tensions often ran high due to the clashing personalities and the strain of having multiple individuals living under one roof. Robin, Marlon's mother, had been in a relationship with Caladea, which added another twist to their shared dynamic. That day, the tension between Marlon and Caladea came to a head during an argument. Reports later revealed that the dispute began over Marlon's criticism of how Caladea disciplined Kira. What started as a verbal disagreement spiraled into something far more sinister. Witnesses described hearing raised voices from inside the house, a sound that wasn't entirely unusual given the household's history of arguments. However, no one could have anticipated what would follow. As the confrontation escalated, Marlon retrieved a firearm and in a moment of rage shot Caladea. The gunfire echoed through the home, sending shockwaves through the neighborhood. Tragically, Marlon didn't stop there. He turned the weapon on Kira, the 11-year-old, ending her young life in a senseless act of brutality. The aftermath of the shootings left the household in chaos. Robin Denson, along with other family members, was present in the home at the time of the murders. The immediate shock and fear paralyzed the household, leaving Robin to process the horror of what her son had just done. After the murders, Marlon fled the scene, leaving the bodies of Caladea and Kira behind. Law enforcement launched an intense manhunt, appealing to the public for help in locating him. For 6 days, he managed to stay on the run, avoiding capture by relying on his knowledge of the local area and receiving assistance from individuals who were unaware of the extent of his crimes. During this time, Marlon's name and face were plastered across news outlets and social media, with authorities warning the public that he was armed and dangerous. His evasion of capture created a sense of fear and urgency within the community. Residents were on high alert, and the victims' loved ones pleaded for justice. The turning point in the manhunt came on January 2018, when Marlon was apprehended by U.S. Marshals. Acting on a tip, they located him hiding in an apartment complex in Lake Worth, just a short distance from the scene of the murders. His capture brought relief to a community still grappling with the horrific nature of his crimes. The trial. Following his arrest on January 2, 2018, Marlon Joseph's case quickly garnered significant media attention. The brutality of his crimes, a double homicide involving a mother and her young daughter, shocked the West Palm Beach community and beyond. As public interest grew, the trial became a focal point for discussions surrounding domestic violence, mental health, and the criminal justice system. The prosecution aimed to paint a clear picture of Marlon's actions and their devastating impact, while the defense attempted to humanize him, focusing on his troubled upbringing and mental health struggles. The stakes were high, as the case involved the possibility of the death penalty, a sentence the state of Florida had not hesitated to pursue in cases of similar severity. The trial commenced in 2019, with both the prosecution and defense delivering compelling opening arguments. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of Marlon's crimes, detailing the sequence of events that led to the deaths of Khalida Crowell and her 11-year-old daughter, Kiera Inglet. They highlighted the evidence linking Marlon to the murders, including ballistic tests, forensic evidence, and witness testimonies. On the other hand, the defense urged the jury to consider Marlon's background and mental state. They argued that his history of trauma, compounded by unresolved psychological issues, had contributed to his actions. While the defense did not deny Marlon's involvement, they sought to spare him from the death penalty by presenting him as a deeply troubled individual rather than a cold-blooded killer. As the trial progressed, the prosecution built a compelling and meticulous case against Marlon Joseph, leaving little room for doubt. Forensic experts provided pivotal testimony detailing the physical evidence that directly implicated him in the murders. The firearm used in the crime was unequivocally tied to Marlon, with ballistic analysis matching the bullets recovered from the crime scene. DNA evidence further confirmed his presence in the house at the time of the murders, solidifying the prosecution's narrative. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from eyewitness testimony. A neighbor recounted hearing gunshots on the day of the murders and witnessing Marlon leaving the residence shortly afterward. This first-hand account was critical in corroborating the timeline of events presented by the prosecution. Investigators also uncovered additional witness accounts that shed light on Marlon's movements in the days following the crime. One individual revealed that Marlon had appeared anxious and evasive during their interaction, but provided no explanation for his behavior, which further raised suspicion. The trial's most emotionally charged moments came when family members of the victims, Khalida Crowell and Kiera Inglet, took the stand. Their heartfelt testimonies painted a vivid picture of the profound loss the murders had caused. Khalida was remembered as a compassionate, loving woman who devoted herself to her daughter and those around her, while Kiera was described as a bright, joyful child with a promising future. Their words moved many in the courtroom to tears, reminding everyone of the human lives behind the tragedy. The overwhelming evidence, combined with these emotional accounts, left little doubt about Marlon's guilt. His attempts to evade capture in the days following the murders only added to the narrative of a man desperate to escape justice. Investigators revealed that he had made sporadic contact with family and acquaintances during this time, often appearing distressed but avoiding any mention of the crime. This behavior, paired with the forensic evidence and eyewitness testimonies, painted a damning picture of Marlon's culpability. The prosecution's ability to piece together a comprehensive and irrefutable case against Marlon was instrumental in securing his conviction. The combination of physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and emotional testimonies created a narrative of deliberate and calculated actions, leaving the defense with little room to counter. The defense faced an uphill battle in countering the prosecution's overwhelming evidence. Their strategy centered on portraying Marlon as a product of his environment, shaped by years of neglect and instability. Psychologists testified about his troubled upbringing, emphasizing the emotional trauma he endured throughout his childhood and adolescence. They also introduced a potential diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder, a condition marked by sudden, intense outbursts of anger, arguing that this disorder may have played a role in Marlon's violent actions. The defense highlighted Marlon's struggles with authority and his inability to form stable relationships. These difficulties, they argued, stemmed from his chaotic home life and fractured familial bonds. By presenting this context, they sought to humanize Marlon, not to excuse his actions, but to encourage the jury to consider life imprisonment as a more compassionate alternative to the death penalty. A pivotal moment for the defense came when Cordarius Joseph, Marlon's brother, took the stand to provide testimony. Cordarius expressed enduring love and support for his brother, despite the devastating crimes he had committed. His testimony served as a reminder of the complex relationships within the family and the lasting emotional toll the case had taken on everyone involved. Cordarius described Marlon as a person deeply shaped by his circumstances and shared moments from their shared past that reflected both Marlon's struggles and his humanity. This heartfelt testimony, combined with the defense's broader argument, aimed to provide the jury with a fuller picture of Marlon's life and the factors that may have contributed to his actions. However, despite these efforts, the overwhelming weight of evidence and the severity of the crimes proved to be a significant obstacle for the defense to overcome. Throughout the trial, media coverage remained intense. The case was widely reported in local and national outlets, with many following every detail of the proceedings. Public opinion was divided. While some sympathized with the defense's portrayal of Marlon as a troubled individual, most were outraged by the senseless loss of life and called for the maximum punishment. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Marlon Joseph was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, a decision that came as little surprise given the strength of the prosecution's case. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, with family members of the victims quietly embracing one another. The sentencing phase of the trial proved equally emotional. Prosecutors argued for the death penalty, emphasizing the premeditated and heinous nature of Marlon's actions. The defense, however, pleaded for mercy, reiterating Marlon's troubled past and psychological issues. Ultimately, the jury recommended the death penalty, a decision that was upheld by the judge. In delivering the sentence, the judge remarked on the severity of Marlon's crimes and the irreparable harm caused to the victims' families. Marlon, for his part, remained expressionless, offering no visible reaction as his fate was sealed. Following his sentencing, Marlon Joseph was transferred to Florida State Prison, where he was placed on death row. This facility houses male death row inmates in single cells, measuring approximately 6 feet wide by 9 feet long by 9.5 feet high. During his time there, Joseph spent most of his days in isolation, reflecting on his actions and their consequences. Joseph maintained limited contact with his family and pursued a series of legal appeals, as is typical in capital punishment cases. His defense team continued to argue for a reduction in his sentence, citing procedural concerns and new insights into his mental health. The death penalty, always a contentious issue, brought additional scrutiny to Marlon's case. Advocacy groups questioned whether his troubled upbringing and mental health challenges had been given adequate consideration during the trial. These concerns were echoed by some members of the legal community, who argued that cases like Marlon's highlighted the need for systemic reform. Despite these debates, Marlon's appeals were ultimately unsuccessful. The courts upheld his conviction and sentence, affirming that the evidence against him was overwhelming and the jury's decision was justified. The last 24 hours. The atmosphere around Marlon Joseph in his final 24 hours shifted noticeably as staff began preparing for the next day's events. Marlon, aware of what was coming, reportedly remained calm and subdued, spending most of the evening alone in his cell. Dinner was brought to him shortly afterward, a standard prison meal consisting of rice, beans, and a small portion of meat. Witnesses noted that he barely touched the food, an early indication of his internal state as the reality of his execution settled in. The hours that followed were uneventful, marked only by routine checks by prison guards and the occasional sound of distant chatter in the corridors. As the prison quieted for the night, Marlon remained awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with a Bible in his hands. While he was not known for being particularly religious during his incarceration, the presence of the Bible suggested he might have been searching for peace or solace in his final hours. Marlon's solitude during this time reflected the isolation he had experienced throughout much of his life. No visitors came to see him that evening, and his interactions were limited to brief exchanges with prison staff. As the hours passed, he eventually lay down to rest. The morning of his execution began early, with guards waking Marlon at 6 a.m. He was given time to wash and prepare himself for the day ahead. Breakfast was brought to him shortly thereafter, consisting of eggs, toast, and coffee. Much like the night before, Marlon ate insufficiently, his appetite seemingly diminished by the gravity of the situation. As the prison buzzed with activity, Marlon's demeanor remained calm. Guards and staff noted his lack of resistance or outward emotion, a stark contrast to what they had witnessed from other inmates in similar circumstances. By mid-morning, Marlon was moved from his regular cell to a holding area closer to the execution chamber. This transfer marked the beginning of the final stages of his journey. The private holding cell was quiet and devoid of distractions, offering little more than a chair, a table, and a small bed. Here, Marlon had the opportunity to make phone calls, reflect, or pray. He requested to speak with a spiritual advisor who spent approximately an hour with him discussing forgiveness and redemption. According to witnesses, Marlon listened intently, though he shared little about his own feelings or thoughts. The most emotional moment of the day came in the early afternoon when Marlon's mother arrived to see him for the final time. The prison allowed them a brief but private visit in a small room near the holding area. Witnesses later described the interaction as tearful, with Marlon's mother expressing her sorrow and disbelief over the path her son's life had taken. Marlon, for his part, seemed composed and even comforted his mother, reassuring her that he had made peace with his fate. Marlon was offered his last meal shortly after his mother's departure. He requested a modest menu: fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, and a slice of chocolate cake. Prison staff observed that Marlon took his time eating, savoring each bite in a way that suggested he was fully aware of its significance. He finished his meal in silence, offering no remarks or expressions to those around him. As the execution drew closer, Marlon was escorted to the execution chamber. Before the formal proceedings began, he was given the opportunity to make a final statement. Standing in front of witnesses, including members of the victims' families, Marlon offered brief words of remorse. He acknowledged the pain he had caused and asked for forgiveness, but avoided delving into the specifics of his crimes. For many in the room, his words felt insufficient. The families of Khalida Krall and Kira Inglet listened intently, hoping for a deeper acknowledgement of the loss he had inflicted. However, Marlon's composure and brevity left much to interpretation, with some viewing it as a sign of resignation and others as an avoidance of accountability. At 6:30 p.m., the final phase began. Witnesses, including members of the victims' families, were seated in the viewing area adjacent to the chamber. Marlon was brought in shortly afterward, escorted by guards who ensured the process remained orderly. His hands and feet were restrained, and he was secured to the gurney where the execution would take place. Throughout the procedure, Marlon remained composed, showing no visible signs of fear or resistance. His calm demeanor continued to raise questions. Was this acceptance of his fate or an act of emotional detachment? With the warden present, the execution order was formally read aloud. Marlon's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling as the medical team prepared the lethal injection. At 6:53 p.m., the drugs were administered, and within moments, Marlon's body began to relax. By 7 p.m., he was pronounced dead at the age 29. What starts as a simple lie can spiral into something far more dangerous, and in Taylor Renee Parker's case, it did. Her web of deception, once seemingly harmless, grew into a disturbing plot that led to the brutal murder of a pregnant mother and the theft of her unborn child. But what will drive someone to commit such an atrocity, and how did she spend her last days? Early life. Taylor Parker was born and raised in a small rural community in Texas. Her childhood was spent in a modest household that seemed unremarkable to outsiders, but was shaped by financial struggles and family tensions. Taylor was the eldest of 3 siblings, often taking on a nurturing role for her younger brother and sister. Her parents, while hardworking, had a tumultuous relationship marked by frequent arguments and periods of instability. Taylor's father worked long hours in construction, while her mother managed the household. Though they tried to provide a stable environment, the financial pressures and emotional strain often left little room for nurturing their children's emotional well-being. Those who knew Taylor as a child described her as bright and creative, but they also noted her flair for exaggeration. Even at a young age, she would tell stories that blurred the line between reality and fantasy, earning her both admiration and skepticism from her peers. Taylor's school years were a mix of promise and challenge. She excelled in English and creative writing, where her talent for crafting narratives shone. Teachers often praised her vivid imagination, encouraging her to pursue storytelling or journalism. However, her academic achievements were overshadowed by her struggle to form stable friendships. Taylor's tendency to embellish stories made her both popular and mistrusted among her peers. By high school, Taylor had developed a reputation for her charm and wit, but also for her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. This passion of Taylor Parker, where she has a constant need to bend the truth, often led to all sorts of vices, including social conflicts, leaving her isolated at times. Despite her challenges, she graduated with aspirations of pursuing a career in marketing or public relations, fields where her charisma and storytelling skills could flourish. However, her plans were soon derailed by the realities of adulthood. In her early 20s, Taylor married her first husband, a relationship that quickly became strained by financial difficulties and personal disagreements. The couple had 2 children in quick succession, which brought moments of joy, but also added stress to an already fragile marriage. Struggling to make ends meet, Taylor took on various jobs, including stints in retail and administrative roles, but none provided the stability she sought. A pivotal moment in Taylor's life came when she decided to undergo a partial hysterectomy after the birth of her second child. This life-altering procedure was intended to address health concerns and prevent future pregnancies. However, it left her emotionally devastated. For someone who often sought validation through her role as a mother and partner, the inability to have more children became a source of profound insecurity. Her marriage continued to deteriorate under the weight of these pressures, ultimately ending in divorce. The loss of her family unit deeply affected Taylor, leaving her feeling adrift and searching for a new sense of purpose. Not long after her divorce, Taylor met Wade Griffin, a construction worker who seemed to offer the promise of a fresh start. The relationship quickly became serious, and Taylor saw Wade as her opportunity to rebuild her life. However, her insecurities and need for control began to surface, especially as she became increasingly dependent on Wade for emotional and financial stability. Taylor's fear of losing Wade drove her to weave a web of lies, starting small but growing increasingly elaborate over time. She painted herself as a self-sufficient woman with a promising future, hiding the financial struggles and emotional scars from her past. This growing reliance on deception would set the stage for the catastrophic events that followed, as Taylor's desperation to maintain her illusion of stability spiraled out of control. The crimes. Taylor Parker's descent into a life of deceit began long before she met Wade Griffin. What started as seemingly harmless embellishments and white lies, a way to entertain or impress those around her, gradually morphed into something far more toxic. Her constant need for spinning stories evolved into a pattern of manipulation, where the lines between unharmful fabrications and destructive deceit blurred completely. Over time, these small, seemingly harmless falsehoods gave way to harmful lies that left lasting scars on those in her orbit. Unable to have more children due to a previous hysterectomy, Taylor became consumed by insecurities, especially as Wade expressed a desire for a family. Determined to keep him, she fabricated a pregnancy, an elaborate lie that would alter her life forever. This deception wasn't impulsive. Taylor meticulously planned every detail, crafting a believable narrative that she shared with Wade, her friends, and even strangers on social media. She posted updates, shared photos of a supposed baby bump, and announced a gender reveal party. Her convincing performance fooled nearly everyone in her life, including Wade, who believed he was about to become a father. Despite Taylor's convincing facade, cracks began to show. Wade noticed inconsistencies, such as her lack of physical changes and the absence of any signs of life from the baby she claimed to carry. When he questioned her, Taylor deflected, blaming the lack of a growing belly on a past tummy tuck. To reinforce her lie, she began wearing a prosthetic belly, further convincing those around her. Her lies extended beyond her pregnancy. Taylor claimed to be a wealthy heiress, telling Wade and his friend Juan that she had inherited a fortune from an oil and gas dynasty. This lie encouraged them to invest their time and money in renovating her home, a project that ran up costs exceeding $50,000. When the promised inheritance failed to materialize, Wade was left to pay Juan out of his own pocket, further straining their relationship. Taylor's obsession with maintaining her false narrative consumed her. As her lies grew, so did her desperation. She spent hours researching ways to fake a premature birth and care for a newborn. Her actions revealed a disturbing level of determination. reflecting her growing disregard for the consequences of her deceit. As her relationship with Wade deteriorated under the weight of her lies, Taylor's desperation drove her to even darker lengths. She began scouting birthing clinics, searching for a victim who could fit into her sinister plan. Her goal was to find a woman whose baby she could steal, a final act of deception that she believed would solidify her fabricated story. Taylor's manipulative tendencies extended beyond Wade. She used WhatsApp messages and emails to spin additional lies, fabricating stories about miscarriages, medical emergencies, and family feuds. These lies isolated Wade from his friends and family, ensuring she maintained control over him. Taylor's false pregnancy also included registering at a hospital for delivery, claiming her labor would be induced on October 9, 2020. Her intricate planning showcased her determination to maintain her lies at all costs, but it also revealed the fragile nature of the house of cards she had built. As time went on, Wade's mother began to grow suspicious of Taylor's claims. Her intuition led her to question the inconsistencies in Taylor's story, urging Wade to trust his instincts. However, Taylor continued to double down, weaving her lies into an almost impenetrable web. On the morning of October 9, 2020, Taylor Parker arrived at the home of 21-year-old Reagan Simmons Hancock under the guise of friendship. Reagan, a kind and trusting young woman, had no reason to suspect the evil intentions behind Taylor's visit. The atmosphere at Reagan's home, filled with excitement for the impending arrival of her baby, quickly turned into a scene of unimaginable terror. Without warning, Taylor launched a brutal attack on Reagan. Armed with a knife, Taylor stabbed her repeatedly, inflicting over 100 wounds. Reagan fought desperately to protect herself and her unborn child, clawing for survival against the relentless assault. But Taylor was determined, her actions fueled by the desperation to maintain the lie that had consumed her life. As Reagan succumbed to her injuries, Taylor escalated her cruelty further. She stabbed Reagan in the head and strangled her to ensure she could no longer fight back. Then, in an act of cold calculation, Taylor used a crude instrument to cut into Reagan's abdomen, forcibly extracting the baby. Her focus was singular, taking the infant she hoped would make her fabricated pregnancy believable. The scene left behind was a house drenched in blood, its silence shattered by the echoes of unimaginable violence. Reagan's body lay motionless on the floor, face down. With the infant in her possession, Taylor fled the scene in a desperate attempt to cover her tracks. She drove toward Idabel, Oklahoma, with the baby still attached to its umbilical cord. Her haste and recklessness betrayed her panic as she sought to finalize the narrative she had been weaving for months. Less than an hour later, Taylor's vehicle was stopped by police officers conducting a routine check. Inside the car, they found Taylor holding the newborn in her lap. The baby, lifeless and pale, was rushed to the hospital in a final attempt to save its life. Tragically, the child was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, marking the end of a short and stolen existence. When confronted by law enforcement, Taylor immediately resorted to lies. She claimed she had given birth in the car, pointing to the baby as evidence of her fabricated story. However, her deception quickly unraveled. A medical examination at the hospital revealed that Taylor had not recently given birth, exposing the gruesome truth behind her actions. Unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded, Reagan's mother arrived at her daughter's home later that morning. She had no idea she was about to walk into a nightmare that would haunt her forever. Upon entering the house, she was greeted by a scene of devastation. Reagan's lifeless body lay face down in a pool of blood, her home transformed into a horrifying crime scene. The silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the weight of the realization that her daughter and grandchild were gone. The shock and grief were overwhelming, an unimaginable burden for any parent to bear. News of the crime spread quickly, shaking the small community to its core. Reagan was a beloved daughter, wife, and friend, known for her warmth and kindness. The loss of such a bright presence, coupled with the cruel theft of her unborn child, left her family and friends struggling to comprehend the depths of Taylor Parker's actions. The trial. The trial of Taylor Parker began as one of the most shocking cases in Texas's recent history. In October 2022, Parker was convicted of capital murder for the brutal killing of 21-year-old Reagan Simmons Hancock and the abduction of her unborn child. The case drew widespread attention for its gruesome details and the cold, calculated nature of Parker's actions. Prosecutors painted Parker as a manipulative con artist who meticulously planned her crime. Witness testimonies were particularly harrowing, with Reagan's family and friends recounting the devastating impact of her death. Evidence presented during the trial revealed the lengths to which Parker went to maintain her fabricated pregnancy, including detailed internet searches and social media posts meant to sell the lie. The jury ultimately found her guilty of capital murder, sentencing her to death. The courtroom was silent as Parker's fate was sealed, with the judge emphasizing the heinous nature of her crime. Reagan's grieving family expressed relief at the verdict, though the pain of their loss was far from erased. Even after her conviction, Taylor Parker's manipulative tendencies persisted. Her time behind bars has been marked by schemes aimed at evading responsibility and exploiting the system. Among her most elaborate ploys was an attempt to frame a mentally unstable inmate for her crimes. Parker fabricated letters, altering handwriting to make it appear as though another inmate was responsible for the gruesome acts. She enlisted other inmates to distribute these falsified documents, hoping to shift blame and sow confusion. Parker's efforts didn't stop there. She also found ways to bypass prison regulations, using others to purchase commissary items on her behalf and avoiding garnishments meant to cover her medical expenses. By having her mother purchase items in other inmates' names, Parker was able to receive goods while circumventing official procedures. Her actions demonstrated her relentless drive to manipulate and deceive. These schemes, however, only further solidified her reputation as a master manipulator, drawing ire from both prison staff and prosecutors. Taylor Parker's disruptive behavior behind bars went beyond her schemes. Prison officials noted that her actions had become so problematic that the facility was forced to implement new policies. Parker frequently filed baseless complaints against jail staff, accusing them of mistreatment and discrimination. She also threatened lawsuits against individual staff members, further straining the already tense environment. Prosecutors revealed that Parker's complaints often included veiled threats of physical harm, a chilling reminder of her capacity for violence. Despite being placed in protective custody, she maintained access to email and telephone systems, writing dozens of monitored letters. These communications provided prosecutors with additional evidence of her ongoing manipulations, which were presented during the penalty phase of her trial. Parker's behavior wasn't limited to legal maneuvers. She made outlandish claims, including boasting about a Netflix documentary deal and a tell-all book contract. Authorities quickly debunked these claims, confirming that no such deals existed. Yet Parker's attempts to gain notoriety added insult to injury for Reagan's grieving family, who were already struggling to process their loss. In April 2022, Taylor Parker took her audacity a step further by reactivating her Snapchat account under the same username she had used before her arrest. This move, widely criticized as tone-deaf and callous, further fueled outrage from the public and Reagan's loved ones. Parker's seeming indifference to the gravity of her actions underscored her inability or refusal to take responsibility. The trial and its aftermath painted a clear picture of Parker's character. From the courtroom to her cell, she remained a figure of manipulation and chaos. While the legal process brought some measure of justice, the scars left by her actions continued to weigh heavily on all those affected. The last 24 hours. After the stunts she pulled, Taylor Parker's final day finally came, and it began quietly on death row. Her cell, barren and unchanging, felt heavier with the realization that time was running out. Breakfast was served promptly at 8:30 a.m., but Taylor barely touched it. Prison guards, accustomed to these moments, noted her unusual calmness. She didn't engage with them, choosing instead to sit silently on the edge of her cot, staring at the wall. Throughout the morning, she was seen pacing her cell, her head occasionally bowing as if lost in thought. Whether Taylor was reflecting on her actions, praying, or simply avoiding the reality of her fate, no one could tell. At noon, Taylor was allowed a few final visits. The first to arrive was her mother, a woman torn between love for her child and the enormity of her crimes. Their conversation, though subdued, carried an undeniable weight. Taylor's mother struggled to find the right words, knowing this would be the last time she saw her daughter alive. Taylor also met with her spiritual advisor. Their dialogue centered on forgiveness and redemption. Yet Taylor appeared emotionally detached. While the advisor emphasized the importance of atonement, Taylor offered little in return. her responses short and guarded. The room where these visits took place felt sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the emotional intensity of the moment. Each second ticked by with an unspoken finality, leaving those present with a mix of sadness, anger, and resignation. By late afternoon, Taylor was offered her last meal, a choice of comfort food she had requested weeks in advance. The tray arrived with her selection: fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and chocolate cake. Although the meal had been prepared to her specifications, she barely touched it. As the clock struck 6, preparations for the execution were set in motion. Taylor was allowed some time for personal reflection and to write letters to her family. The letters, handed to prison officials, were sealed and marked with the names of her children and her mother. The contents remained undisclosed, but staff who interacted with her noted that she displayed no visible signs of remorse or regret. Prison protocol required Taylor to be moved to the holding area near the execution chamber. Flanked by guards, she walked steadily, her hands cuffed and her expression blank. The short journey was silent, save for the faint echo of her footsteps against the concrete floor. Taylor was led into the brightly lit execution chamber, a space clinical in its design and devoid of emotion. She was secured to the gurney with leather straps, her arms outstretched to prepare for the lethal injection. The room was filled with witnesses, including members of Reagan Simmons Hancock's family. Their faces reflected a mix of grief, anger, and quiet resolve. For them, this moment was not about vengeance, but justice, an attempt to bring closure to the nightmare Taylor had unleashed. When given the opportunity to offer final words, Taylor hesitated. Her voice, though steady, carried no apology. Instead, she spoke briefly about her children, expressing a desire for them to remember her differently. Her refusal to acknowledge the gravity of her crimes left the room in a stunned silence. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the execution process began. The first drug was administered, designed to induce unconsciousness. Taylor's breathing slowed as her body relaxed against the restraints. Within moments, the second and third drugs followed, stopping her heart. By 8:20 p.m., the attending physician pronounced her dead. 3 young women, Krista Pike, Tiffany Cole, and Amelia Carr, barely out of their teens, committed crimes so brutal even full-grown adults can't execute. From torturing victims to burying them alive, their actions earned them a place on death row. Now, as the clock ticks toward their execution, we uncover the disturbing stories behind their deadly decisions. Are their fates sealed, or could they somehow escape the ultimate punishment? Krista Pike. Krista Pike's life began in West Virginia, where her early years were full of instability and emotional turmoil. Raised in an environment lacking the guidance and stability she needed, Krista faced numerous challenges growing up. Toxic family relationships and a chaotic home life made it difficult for her to find a sense of direction or purpose. Seeking an escape from her troubled past, Krista joined the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee. This federally funded initiative aimed to help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds acquire education and job skills, offering them a second chance at building a better future. For many, the program was a beacon of hope, but for Krista, it became the setting for a tragic and violent chapter in her life. It was through the Job Corps program that Krista met Tadaro Shipp, a charismatic and rebellious young man. Their connection was immediate and intense, quickly developing into a relationship that would have a profound and destructive influence on her life. Tadaro, with his confident demeanor and unconventional interests, offered Krista a sense of validation she had long been searching for. However, their bond was far from healthy, as it fed into Krista's insecurities and set the stage for the horrifying events to come. Krista's relationship with Tadaro was not only passionate but also toxic. Reports indicate that Tadaro introduced her to dark and manipulative behaviors, including an interest in occult practices. As their relationship deepened, so did Krista's dependence on him. This dynamic led her to view other women as threats, particularly Colleen Slemmer, a fellow participant in the Job Corps program. Krista became convinced that Colleen, a 19-year-old woman, was trying to steal Tadaro's affection. Whether this belief had any basis in reality or was a product of Krista's imagination remains unclear. What is certain is that her jealousy grew into an obsession, and she began to see Colleen as a rival who needed to be eliminated. Fueled by her insecurity and desire to assert control, Krista orchestrated a plan to confront Colleen. On January 12, 1995, she, Tadaro, and another participant, Shadola Peterson, lured Colleen to a secluded area on the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus. What Colleen thought might be a routine meeting turned out to be anything but. The crime. Once the group reached the remote location, the confrontation quickly escalated into a horrifying attack. Krista led the assault, driven by jealousy and a need to assert dominance. Over the course of 30 agonizing minutes, Colleen was subjected to unspeakable cruelty. Krista and Taddaryl inflicted deep cuts on Colleen, taunting her throughout the ordeal. The assault was brutal, with Colleen enduring beatings and severe injuries. Krista's rage and determination to exact revenge were evident as she took the lead in the attack. The culmination of the violence came when Krista used a large rock to strike the final blow, ending Colleen's life in an act of cold-blooded brutality. The crime didn't end there. In a chilling move that would later shock investigators and the public, Krista kept a piece of Colleen's skull as a trophy. This grotesque act symbolized the cruelty and premeditation of the crime, serving as a haunting reminder of Colleen's suffering. Shadala Peterson, who accompanied Krista and Taddaryl, played a lesser role in the attack. While she didn't actively participate in the violence, her presence and failure to intervene made her complicit in the crime. For Colleen's family, the details of her murder were devastating, leaving them to grapple with the loss of a bright and promising young woman. Investigators quickly determined that the murder of Colleen Slemmer was no impromptu crime. The attack was premeditated, driven by Krista's jealousy and fueled by her toxic relationship with Taddaryl. Witnesses and evidence pointed to a calculated plan to lure Colleen to her death. While Taddaryl played a significant role in the crime, Krista emerged as the ringleader, the driving force behind the attack. Her actions were deliberate and cruel, leaving little doubt about her intent. The piece of Colleen's skull that Krista kept as a trophy became a key piece of evidence, highlighting the extent of her callousness. The trial. Krista Pike's trial unfolded swiftly, with prosecutors presenting a case that left little room for doubt. The evidence against her was overwhelming, from the testimony of Shadala Peterson, who witnessed the brutal attack, to the physical evidence linking Krista to the murder of Colleen Slemmer. It became clear that this was a premeditated act of violence. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the fragment of Colleen's skull found in Krista's possession, a grotesque trophy that underscored the callousness of the crime. The prosecution painted Krista as the ringleader, someone who orchestrated and executed the attack out of jealousy and spite. Her actions, they argued, went far beyond a moment of rage. They were calculated and deliberate. Krista's role as the driving force behind the crime became a focal point of the trial. Taddaryl Shipp, her boyfriend at the time, was also implicated, but as he was 17 during the crime, he avoided the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison. Shadala Peterson, who cooperated with investigators, was given probation in exchange for her testimony. Krista's defense team fought to save her from the ultimate punishment. They highlighted her age. She was only 18 at the time of the murder, and argued that she lacked the maturity and judgment of an adult. Her turbulent upbringing was also presented as a mitigating factor, with her legal team emphasizing the instability and emotional neglect she endured as a child. Additionally, they pointed to her relationship with Taddaryl Shipp, describing him as a manipulative figure who influenced Krista's actions and introduced her to a darker way of thinking. Despite these arguments, the jury was unmoved. The brutality of the crime and Krista's lack of remorse were impossible to overlook. In 1996, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, making her the youngest woman on Tennessee's death row. The case became a lightning rod for debates surrounding the death penalty, particularly when it involved young offenders and individuals with troubled pasts. Life on death row. Since her conviction, Krista Pike has remained on death row at the Tennessee Prison for Women. Her life behind bars has been defined by isolation, reflection, and the constant uncertainty of her future. The appeals process has been exhaustive, with her legal team arguing against her execution on the grounds of her age at the time of the crime and her mental health. They have repeatedly cited her turbulent upbringing, her undiagnosed mental health conditions, and her susceptibility to Taddaryl Shipp's influence. Life on death row is stark and regimented. For Krista, the days are long and repetitive, with limited interaction and even less hope. Over the years, she has been involved in legal efforts to overturn or delay her sentence. Her defense has raised questions about whether someone so young with such a difficult past should face the ultimate punishment. These arguments have been met with mixed responses, with some advocating for leniency and others calling for the sentence to be carried out as a deterrent for future crimes. For many on death row, The waiting is often the hardest part. Days turn into months, and months into years, with each appeal representing a flicker of hope that could just as easily be extinguished. Krista's case is no different, as the legal battles continue to shape her reality. While her defense team argues for her life, the state continues to press for the sentence to be carried out, citing the heinous nature of the crime and the clear evidence of her guilt. Tiffany Cole. Tiffany Cole's life before her infamous crime appeared ordinary. Born in South Carolina, she spent much of her early life in Jacksonville, Florida, where she became neighbors with James and Carol Sumner. The Sumners, a retired couple, were kind-hearted and trusting, qualities that Tiffany would later exploit in a way that shocked the nation. By all accounts, Tiffany didn't display signs of a troubled or criminal upbringing. Her limited criminal history gave no indication of the darkness to come. However, her relationship with Michael Jackson, her boyfriend at the time, marked a turning point in her life. Jackson was known to have a more questionable character, and their relationship would eventually lead Tiffany down a path of manipulation, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty. The Sumners had sold their Jacksonville home to Tiffany's father and relocated to Georgia. Despite the distance, they maintained a friendly relationship with Tiffany. This connection, forged through years of familiarity, created a sense of trust between them and their former neighbor. It was this trust that Tiffany and her accomplices would use to carry out their plan. The crime. In June 2005, Tiffany Cole and Michael Jackson, along with their accomplices Alan Wade and Bruce Nixon, devised a plan to rob the Sumners. Their plot wasn't just about theft. It involved a level of premeditation and cruelty that shocked investigators and the public alike. The group began by digging a grave in Charlton County, Georgia, 2 days before visiting the Sumners in Jacksonville. This grave was a chilling sign of the fate that awaited the unsuspecting couple. On June 8, 2005, Tiffany and Michael approached the Sumners' home, pretending they needed to borrow a phone. Trusting their former neighbor, James and Carol let them in, unaware of the sinister intentions behind the visit. Once inside, the couple was ambushed. James was choked and forced to provide the PIN for his ATM card, while both he and Carol were bound and gagged with duct tape. The group then shoved the terrified couple into the trunk of their own car and drove them across the state line to Georgia. At the pre-dug grave, the true horror of the crime unfolded. The Sumners were blindfolded, still bound, and pushed into the grave. While still alive, they were buried, leaving them to suffocate under the weight of the earth. The brutality of the act, burying two people alive, was incomprehensible, marking this as one of the most heinous crimes in Florida's history. The crime didn't stop with the Sumners' deaths. Tiffany and her accomplices proceeded to pawn the couple's belongings, including jewelry, and used their ATM card to withdraw over $1,000. They stayed in a hotel where they were later photographed celebrating their ill-gotten gains. The images, showing them in a limousine with champagne and cash, became infamous as evidence of their cold disregard for the lives they had taken. Investigators quickly began to piece together the crime. The group's careless spending and the use of the Sumners' ATM card created a trail that led law enforcement directly to them. When police raided the hotel where Tiffany, Michael, and the others were staying, they discovered a trove of incriminating evidence. This included the Sumners' driver's licenses, credit cards, social security information, and other personal documents. The victim's checkbook, mail, and a collection of coins were also found, further cementing the group's involvement. Bruce Nixon, one of the accomplices, eventually confessed to his role in the crime. He led authorities to the burial site, where the remains of James and Carol Sumner were uncovered. The discovery was devastating, revealing the full extent of the group's actions. Nixon's cooperation proved critical in building the case against Tiffany and the others. The trial. Tiffany Cole's trial painted a disturbing picture of betrayal and greed. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Investigators discovered the Sumners' personal belongings in the hotel room Tiffany shared with her co-defendants. Items such as their driver's licenses, credit cards, social security information, and personal documents served as a stark reminder of how thoroughly their lives had been exploited. Jewelry, a collection of rare coins, and even their checkbook were also recovered, along with a series of newly purchased items bought using the stolen money. Prosecutors argued that Tiffany was a central figure in the crime. Her connection to the victims was pivotal. Without her relationship with James and Carol Sumner, the crime might never have been possible. She exploited their trust to gain access to their home and orchestrated their kidnapping and murder alongside her accomplices, Michael Jackson, Alan Wade, and Bruce Nixon. During the trial, photographs of Tiffany and her co-conspirators celebrating with champagne and stolen cash became key evidence. The images showed a disturbing lack of remorse, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that the crime was not just premeditated, but also carried out with cold-hearted cruelty. The jury's decision came quickly. After less than 90 minutes of deliberation, Tiffany Cole was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. In a 9-3 vote, the jury recommended the death penalty. Her role as a trusted neighbor and her participation in the horrifying act of burying the Sumners alive weighed heavily on the decision. The judge, in his sentencing, described Tiffany's actions as calculated and cruel. He condemned the betrayal and the suffering inflicted upon the Sumners, noting the unimaginable fear they must have experienced in their final moments. Tiffany was sentenced to death by lethal injection, alongside additional convictions for kidnapping and robbery. Life on death row. Following her conviction, Tiffany Cole was sent to the Lowell Correctional Institution Annex in Florida, where she joined the ranks of women awaiting execution. Life on death row is solitary and stark, with little interaction and minimal comforts. For Tiffany, this isolation was a far cry from the life of freedom and opportunity she had once known. Her days were marked by monotony, with strict routines and limited human contact. Inmates on death row are kept in small cells for most of the day, with restricted time for recreation or exercise. The stark conditions provide ample time for reflection, though for many they also bring profound loneliness and despair. Despite her circumstances, Tiffany has maintained that she did not fully understand the extent of the crime. During her trial, she claimed she believed the plan was only to steal from the Sumners, not to harm them. However, the evidence presented during her trial, including her active participation in the kidnapping and murder, contradicted these claims. Over the years, Tiffany's legal team has worked to appeal her sentence. They argued that she was heavily influenced by Michael Jackson and lacked the awareness to grasp the gravity of her actions. However, these arguments have done little to sway public opinion or the courts. The brutality of the crime and Tiffany's betrayal of the Sumners remain the defining elements of her case. Amelia Carr. Amelia Carr's early life was defined by a mix of potential and adversity. Born in Florida, she grew up in a challenging environment that shaped her outlook and decisions. Despite being recognized as highly intelligent, with an IQ estimated at 125, Amelia's childhood was marred by trauma. She experienced significant abuse, including allegations of physical mistreatment by her father, though she reported these incidents to school authorities. At one point, she later recanted her statements, a decision that weighed heavily on her throughout her life. The effects of her early experiences lingered into her adulthood, leaving emotional scars and a turbulent path ahead. Despite her intelligence, Amelia struggled to find stability. This struggle intensified when she became romantically involved with Joshua Fulgham. Their relationship was volatile, marked by manipulation and emotional entanglement. Amelia's involvement with Fulgham continued even after he abruptly ended their engagement and married Heather Strong, a 26-year-old mother of two, in 2008. This complex and unhealthy dynamic between Amelia, Fulgham, and Heather would eventually spiral into jealousy, betrayal, and a shocking crime that ended in tragedy. By early 2009, tensions between Amelia, Fulgham, and Heather had reached a breaking point. Heather and Joshua's marriage was rocky from the start, and Amelia's continued presence in their lives only added to the strain. It was clear that the situation was volatile, but few could have predicted the horrific events that were about to unfold. On February 15, 2009, Heather Strong disappeared from the Iron Skillet restaurant where she worked in Reddick, Florida. At first, there were few clues about her whereabouts, though suspicions soon turned to Joshua Fulgham and Amelia Carr. What emerged was a chilling narrative of jealousy and manipulation. According to the investigation, Amelia and Joshua conspired to lure Heather to a storage trailer located behind Amelia's mother's home. Under the pretense of resolving issues related to their contentious relationships, they convinced Heather to meet with them. However, the meeting was a ruse, designed to isolate Heather and carry out a sinister plan. Once Heather was inside the trailer, Amelia and Joshua attacked her. They attempted to break her neck, but when that failed, they resorted to suffocation. Heather, bound with duct tape, fought desperately for her life, but the odds were against her. In the end, she died of asphyxiation while still tied to a chair. The horror didn't end there. After Heather's death, Amelia and Joshua transported her body to a shallow grave they had prepared near McIntosh, Florida. There, they buried her, attempting to cover their tracks and erase evidence of the crime. It was a shocking and brutal act driven by jealousy and betrayal. Heather's disappearance quickly caught the attention of law enforcement. Suspicion fell on Fulgham when he began using Heather's credit cards shortly after she went missing. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his statements, which only deepened their interest in him and his connection to Amelia Carr. On March 19, 2009, more than a month after Heather's disappearance, her remains were discovered in the shallow grave. The gruesome discovery confirmed the worst fears of her family and friends. Investigators intensified their focus on Amelia and Joshua, piecing together evidence that tied them to the crime. Amelia's behavior in the days leading up to her arrest added to the case against her. She was recorded on undercover audio discussing details of the crime with Fulgham's sister. This evidence, combined with her inconsistent statements and damning physical evidence, led to her arrest on March 24, 2009. At the time, Amelia was 7 months pregnant with Joshua Fulgham's child, adding another layer of complexity to the case. Amelia initially confessed to her involvement in the crime, claiming she did so out of fear and desperation. She later recanted her confession, stating that she only admitted to the crime in the hope of reuniting with her children, all of whom had been placed in foster care. The trial. Amelia Carr's trial was as emotionally charged as the crime itself, revealing a complex web of motives and circumstances. Following her arrest in March 2009, Amelia initially confessed to her role in Heather Strong's murder. However, she later recanted this confession, claiming she had only admitted to the crime in a desperate attempt to be reunited with her children, who had been placed in foster care. This change in her account added an additional layer of complexity to an already high-profile case. During the trial, the prosecution painted Amelia as a central figure in the brutal murder. They presented evidence of her active participation in luring Heather to the storage trailer, where she and Joshua Fulgham carried out the attack. The chilling details of Heather's final moments, from the failed attempt to break her neck to her eventual death by suffocation, left little doubt about the deliberate nature of the crime. Amelia's defense team, however, focused on her troubled upbringing. Testimony from family members revealed that Amelia endured significant trauma as a child, including physical abuse by her father. Her attorneys argued that this abuse left her emotionally scarred, making her vulnerable to manipulation by Joshua Fulgham. They claimed that Amelia was not the mastermind, but a victim of Fulgham's influence, dragged into the crime by her toxic relationship with him. Despite these efforts, the jury was unconvinced. The prosecution's evidence, which included Amelia's recorded conversations discussing details of the crime, painted her as a willing participant. Additionally, her behavior during and after the crime, including the disposal of Heather's body, suggested a level of premeditation that was hard to ignore. In December 2010, Amelia Carr was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. The judge who delivered the sentence condemned the brutality of her actions, calling her a cold and calculated individual. Amelia's conviction made her one of the youngest women on death row in the United States at the time. Life on death row. Following her sentencing, Amelia Carr was sent to the Lowell Correctional Institution Annex in Florida, where she joined a small group of women awaiting execution. Life on death row is one of isolation and routine, a stark contrast to the outside world. For Amelia, each day brought hours of solitude and reflection, broken only by limited interactions with prison staff and other inmates. Amelia's time on death row was marked by repeated attempts to appeal her sentence. Her legal team argued that her abusive childhood and influence from Joshua Fulgham were mitigating factors that should have spared her from the death penalty. They also questioned the fairness of her trial, pointing to the emotional weight of the prosecution's case and the challenges of overcoming her initial confession. However, the brutality of the crime and the overwhelming evidence against her made these appeals an uphill battle. The court repeatedly upheld her conviction and sentence, affirming that Amelia's role in Heather Strong's murder warranted the harshest punishment. For many on death row, life is defined by a mix of reflection and uncertainty. The passage of time brings moments of introspection, but also the looming reality of execution. While Amelia may have sought to make sense of her choices, the weight of her actions continued to cast a long shadow over her life.